The lecture hall of the Galactic Academy buzzed with the soft chittering and whistling of 100 different species settling into their seats, and Hyun adjusted his translator earpiece as he slid into his usual spot near the back, where the human-sized chairs were located. Watching Professor Velnir's forearms arranged data tablets across the podium with practiced efficiency, while the afternoon sun of the station's artificial sky cast long shadows through the crystalline windows, and he could see his roommate Day already half asleep 3 rows ahead, despite the importance of today's topic on predator-prey dynamics across civilized worlds, something the professor had been building toward for 3 weeks now, with increasing enthusiasm that made her antennae quiver whenever she spoke about evolutionary certainties. Professor Velnir cleared her throat with a sound like wind through reeds, and her large compound eyes swept across the assembled students from dozens of worlds as she began speaking, in the melodious Quillarian language that the translators converted into comprehensible speech for each listener, and she projected a hologram above the podium, showing a familiar chart of galactic civilization timelines with species, after species following remarkably similar patterns of development, from their primitive origins to their eventual joining of the greater community. And Hyun leaned forward with genuine interest because he always enjoyed when the lessons touched on the commonalities between such wildly different peoples who had somehow all ended up here together among the stars despite their vastly different biologies and home environments. Today we discuss what I consider the most fundamental universal constant in all of civilization studies, Velnir announced with the kind of gravity that made even Day's eyes flutter open in the front rows, and she gestured at the hologram with 2 of her 4 hands, while the other 2 manipulated controls to bring up images of creatures from various worlds, all of them displaying prominent fangs or claws or other obvious predatory features that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. And Hyun recognized the instinctive unease rippling through the room as the same kind of reaction he had seen in the cafeteria when someone accidentally played Earth-nature documentary footage on the public screens, which had resulted in 3 fainting incidents and a formal complaint to the Student Affairs Office about traumatic content. In all of galactic history spanning millions of years and thousands of surveyed worlds, not one sapient species has ever domesticated or befriended an apex predator. Velnir continued as she highlighted each creature in turn with a laser pointer that danced across their threatening features, and the translator caught the emphasis she placed on the word never, with its implications of absolute certainty, backed by countless research papers and archaeological evidence, and Hyun could see other students nodding along as if this was the most obvious truth they had ever heard. While a Kelthian student named Boren in the row beside him made a note on his tablet with careful precision, and the scratch of stylus on screen seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden, attentive silence, the professor explained how every known civilization had evolved from either herbivorous species or scavengers who avoided direct confrontation with predators at all costs, and she showed brain scans demonstrating the deep-seated fear responses that even modern civilized species experienced when confronted with predatory features like forward-facing eyes or prominent canine teeth. And these responses were not cultural but biological, burned into their very DNA through millions of years of being prey animals who survived only by recognizing and fleeing from danger. And she pointed out how even now, in the enlightened age of spaceflight and galactic unity, most species felt uncomfortable around the Taraxians who had descended from ambush predators, though the Taraxians themselves had long since evolved past their hunting days, and now were strictly vegetarian by cultural choice, if not biological necessity. The idea of inviting a predator into one's home, of allowing it near one's offspring, of forming emotional bonds with a creature designed by evolution to hunt and kill, Velnir said with a dismissive wave of her upper right hand that made her sleeve flutter like wings. This is not merely inadvisable but represents a psychological impossibility, a contradiction so fundamental that no sane species would even attempt it, and those few instances in primitive cultures where such attempts were made invariably ended in tragedy, which merely reinforced the lesson that predators and prey can never be friends, can never share space peacefully, can never overcome the basic programming of their evolutionary heritage. Students around the room shared looks of agreement, and several made affirmative gestures according to their species' customs, while a teaching assistant named Risa stood near the wall with her tablet recording the lecture for later distribution, and Hyun found himself frowning slightly as he thought about the contents of his dorm room and the pictures on his personal tablet, and he caught Dae's eye across the rows of seats and saw his roommate grinning with that particular expression that meant trouble was about to happen, because Dae knew exactly what Hyun was thinking about and could probably predict what would happen next. The professor moved into specific examples from various worlds, describing how the Quillarians had nearly been driven extinct by pack hunters on their homeworld before developing the technology to build protective cities, and how the Keltians still maintained automated defense systems around their settlements to ward off the massive-scaled beasts that prowled their jungles, and how the Vraxi had actually succeeded in exterminating every large predator on their planet within a century of achieving industrial technology, because the collective trauma was so great, and each story reinforced the central thesis that predators were threats to be avoided or eliminated, but never befriended, and the universal agreement in the room felt absolute and unshakable. This is not a cultural bias but an observable fact verified across the entire known galaxy. Velnir declared with the finality of someone closing a case that had been tried and settled long ago, and she folded all four arms across her thorax in a gesture of completion, and the hologram shifted to show a summary slide with the key points listed in multiple languages, and Hyun could feel the weight of all that certainty pressing down on the room like a physical force, and he hesitated for a long moment before slowly raising his hand among the sea of appendages and tentacles and other limbs, and the motion caught Velnir's compound eyes as she prepared to dismiss the class for the day. "Yes, Hyun," the professor said with the patient tone she reserved for the human students who sometimes asked questions that revealed how little Earth understood about galactic norms. And several students turned to look at him with curiosity, since humans were still relatively new to the academy, and their questions often provided entertainment, and Risa's antennae perked up with interest as she adjusted her tablet to record whatever naive or confused inquiry the human was about to make. And Dae was definitely grinning now with barely suppressed laughter. Hyun stood up as was polite in human culture when addressing a professor, and he could feel dozens of eyes and eye analogs focusing on him as he spoke clearly into the quiet room, and his translator picked up his words and broadcast them in a dozen languages simultaneously, as he asked with perfect innocence and genuine friendliness, "Would you like to see my cat?" The silence that followed was profound and confused, and Velnir's antennae drooped in bewilderment as she tried to parse what translation error might have occurred, and other students looked at each other with the universal expression of people who had just heard something that made no sense whatsoever, and several reached for their own translators to check if the devices were malfunctioning, and Boren leaned over to Hyun and whispered urgently that perhaps the human had misunderstood the lecture's content. "Your cat?" Velnir repeated slowly as if testing each word for hidden meaning, and her translator must have flagged the term because she pulled up a quick reference on her tablet, and her antennae shot straight up in alarm as Earth's taxonomic database provided images and descriptions, and her voice came out higher pitched than normal as she said, "This is a obligate carnivore, an apex predator of your world with retractable claws and hunting instincts, and you keep this creature as a pet?" Hyun nodded enthusiastically and pulled out his personal tablet to show pictures, while other students craned their necks or extended eye stalks to see, and there on the screen was an orange tabby cat lounging in a sunbeam, and another image showed the same cat sleeping on Hyun's chest, and a video played showing the cat purring and rubbing against his legs, and the reaction in the lecture hall was immediate and visceral, and several students made sounds of distress while others pulled back from the screen as if the images themselves were dangerous. "This is impossible," Velnir stated flatly, though her voice wavered with uncertainty, and she stared at the images like they were elaborate hoaxes, and Dae had given up trying to contain his laughter now, and was explaining loudly to anyone who would listen that he also had pictures of his family's dog, and the word dog sent Risa scrambling for her own database access, because surely this couldn't get worse, but of course it did. The human dormitory section of the Academy station had become unexpectedly crowded within an hour of the lecture ending, and Hyun's small shared room now contained not just himself and Dae, but also Boren the Kelthian student, whose scientific curiosity had overcome his obvious nervousness, Risa the teaching assistant who had arrived with recording equipment and 3 different tablets, and a small floating drone that Professor Velnir was operating remotely, because she refused to be physically present until she could verify that no actual predators were in the room. And the cramped space felt even smaller with everyone trying to maintain what they considered safe distances from each other. while also crowding around Hyun's display screen. "Show us everything," Risa demanded with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged. And her antennae kept twitching between curiosity and alarm as Hyun pulled up his photo library on the large screen. And the first image that appeared was Commander Whiskers sitting regally on a windowsill back on Earth, with the sunset behind him, making his orange fur glow like fire. And Boren made a hissing sound of distress and took 2 steps backward until he bumped into the wall. Day had already opened his own collection and was gleefully narrating each image for their alien audience, describing how his family's golden retriever named Butter loved to play fetch and sleep on the couch and steal food from the counter when no one was looking. And he showed videos of Butter playing with Day's younger sister, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old in the footage. And the child was laughing while the large predator with its prominent teeth gently took treats from her tiny hand. And Professor Velnir's voice came through the drone speaker sharp with disbelief, asking how many humans had been killed by such creatures living in their homes. Killed? Hyun repeated as if the question itself was strange. And he pulled up statistical data from Earth's animal control databases while explaining that yes, sometimes accidents happened, but they were remarkably rare, considering that humans kept hundreds of millions of these predators in their homes voluntarily, and the number of actual fatalities per year was so low that more humans died from falling off furniture than from their pet cats and dogs. And this information seemed to make the situation worse rather than better from the aliens' perspective. "You are saying that you keep creatures capable of killing you, but they choose not to," Risa said slowly as she tried to process this information logically. And her hands moved across her tablets, inputting notes faster than Hyun could track. And she pulled up comparative data showing that every other species in the galaxy had strict prohibitions against keeping predators as companions, and even the few historical attempts had been by individuals considered mentally unstable. And those attempts had ended exactly as expected with injury or death. Boren had recovered enough to move closer to the screen again, and he pointed at Commander Whiskers with one clawed finger while asking technical questions about the cat's hunting capabilities. And Hyun explained about the retractable claws and the exceptional night vision, and the ability to jump 6 times their body length, and the flexible spine that allowed them to always land on their feet, and the specialized teeth designed for shearing meat. And with each feature, Boren's eyes grew wider and his scales rippled with patterns that Hyun had learned meant extreme agitation in Kelthian body language. Day decided to make things more interesting by pulling up a documentary about wolf domestication, and the video showed ancient humans somehow convincing wild wolves to live alongside them thousands of years ago. And these were not small creatures but pack hunters capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves. And the narrator explained how over generations humans and wolves formed bonds that eventually led to modern dogs. And Professor Velnir's drone actually wobbled in the air, as if the professor controlling it had forgotten how to maintain stable flight. "This is not domestication in any sense we understand." Velnir's voice came through with academic precision, trying to mask obvious distress. "Domestication implies selecting for useful traits like wool production or milk or transportation. But these creatures provide no such resources. They consume your food, they require care and attention, they serve no practical purpose except companionship with beings that could easily harm you." Hyun smiled and nodded in agreement while completely missing the professor's point. And he said that yes, that was exactly right. Humans kept these predators purely for companionship and love. And the word love seemed to short-circuit something in the aliens' understanding, because Risa dropped one of her tablets and had to scramble to catch it before it hit the floor. And Boren made a sound like a kettle boiling over. Another human student named Taemin arrived at the door, having heard about the gathering through the student network. And he squeezed into the already crowded room, bringing with him even more evidence on his tablet. And he had pictures of his family's 3 cats and 2 dogs all living together in the same house. And he showed videos of the animals sleeping together in piles, grooming each other, playing together despite being different species of predator. And he cheerfully explained that multi-pet households were extremely common on Earth. "How do you sleep at night knowing these creatures are in your home?" Boren asked with genuine confusion. And Taemin laughed and showed a picture of himself as a child curled up in bed with a large German shepherd that looked like it could easily overpower a grown human. And he explained that many humans found it comforting to sleep near their pets, that the animals provided a sense of security and warmth, and Day added that Commander Whiskers preferred to sleep directly on Hyun's chest or face, which sometimes made breathing difficult but was apparently worth it. Risa had connected her tablets to the galactic academic database and was pulling up papers and studies from thousands of researchers across hundreds of worlds, and she projected the results on the wall, showing the universal consensus that predator-prey bonding was impossible due to fundamental neurological incompatibilities. And she highlighted the brain chemistry studies that showed how prey species experienced stress responses when near predatory features. And she turned to the humans with her antennae quivering and asked how their brains could possibly override millions of years of evolutionary programming. Taemin offered to explain and pulled up Earth's research on the subject, showing brain scans of humans interacting with their pets, and the scans showed oxytocin release patterns identical to those seen during parent-child bonding, and the humans' brains were literally treating these predators as family members worthy of protection and affection. And Risa stared at the data for a long moment before making a sound that the translator rendered as confused distress. "But you are predators yourselves." Professor Velnir's voice came through the drone with sudden realization, and she had clearly been doing her own research on human evolution while monitoring the conversation, and she brought up Earth's taxonomic classification, showing humans as persistence hunters with forward-facing eyes and omnivorous teeth. And she stated that perhaps predators could befriend other predators because they lacked the prey instinct, and the room fell silent as everyone considered this theory. Hyun shook his head and explained that humans were actually quite aware of danger and had plenty of fear responses. And he showed news reports of humans being afraid of spiders and snakes and sharks, and he pointed out that humans knew these animals could hurt them, but chose to build relationships anyway. And Day added that humans had literally domesticated prey animals too, like rabbits and guinea pigs and horses. So it wasn't about being predator or prey, but about humans' apparent need to befriend everything they encountered. "Show me the most dangerous predator that humans keep as pets," Boren demanded with the air of someone who needed to see the absolute worst to fully understand. And Taemin and Hyun and Day all exchanged glances before Taemin pulled up pictures and videos. And he showed families who ran sanctuaries for big cats, lions and tigers and leopards that had been rescued from bad situations. And while these weren't exactly pets in the traditional sense, humans still formed bonds with them. And there was footage of a woman hugging a fully grown lion that responded with obvious affection. The room erupted in multiple languages of alarm, and Risa's antennae went completely flat against her head, which Hyun had learned was the Quillarian equivalent of fainting. And Boren backed up against the wall again, making sounds that needed no translation. And Professor Velnir's drone crashed into the ceiling before she regained control, and her voice came through shaky as she said that she needed to consult with the Academy administration immediately. Day mentioned almost casually that his friend Mirai was supposed to be arriving at the station next month with her dog as soon as it cleared quarantine protocols, and the dog in question was a Siberian husky that looked remarkably wolf-like. And he showed pictures of Mirai's 2 young children playing with this large predator in their backyard, and the children were laughing while the dog gently pulled them around on a sled through snow. And Taemin added that wait until they learned about horses, and how humans sat on top of prey animals that could easily kick them to death, but instead chose to carry humans around. The xenobiology laboratory had been transformed over the past 2 weeks into something resembling a high-security containment facility. And Hyun stood in the observation area watching technicians install what appeared to be reinforced barriers made of transparent aluminum, while Professor Velnir supervised with 3 of her 4 hands gesturing instructions and the 4th clutching a data tablet like a security blanket. And Dean Qualris of the Academy administration had arrived personally to oversee what was being called the most significant xenosociological demonstration in recent galactic history. And the fact that all this preparation was for a simple house cat would have been funny if everyone involved wasn't taking it so seriously. Ji-won had arrived from Earth 2 days ago with the special transport container, and she stood near Hyun looking both amused and exasperated at the level of security surrounding her task. And she was a veterinary medicine student who had volunteered to handle the demonstration after the Academy put out an urgent request for someone qualified to manage Earth predators in a controlled environment, and her credentials included 3 years working at an animal shelter and a remarkable ability to remain calm under pressure. And right now she was reading through the safety protocols that the station security had drawn up, which included provisions for armed response teams and emergency medical staff. They want me to wear protective armor, Ji-won said, holding up a form for Hyun to see, and her expression suggested she was trying very hard not to laugh. And Hyun looked at the specifications, which appeared designed to withstand attacks from creatures much larger and more dangerous than Commander Whiskers, and he had to admit that from the alien's perspective this probably seemed like reasonable precaution. Day arrived with Taemin, and they joined the small group of humans who had been cleared to be inside the demonstration area. And a human security officer named Young-ho was also present, because the station administrators had insisted on having someone from Earth's security forces available just in case. Though what he was supposed to do against a 7-pound cat was unclear, and Young-ho kept checking his equipment with the air of someone who knew this was ridiculous but was getting paid well enough not to care. The observation area behind the barriers was filling up with students and faculty from across the academy, and Hyun could see Boren claiming a front-row position, despite his obvious nervousness. And Risa was there with enough recording equipment to document a major scientific expedition, and Professor Velnir had positioned herself near the emergency exit while trying to appear academically detached. And dozens of other aliens crowded in, all maintaining careful distance from the barriers as if proximity itself was dangerous. Dean Qualris called the demonstration to order, and her Taraxian features arranged themselves in what might have been a serious expression, though humans found Taraxian faces difficult to read, and she explained in her deep rumbling voice that this was being conducted under the strictest scientific protocols, and multiple sensors were monitoring stress levels and biological responses in all participants, and medical teams were standing by, though everyone hoped they would not be needed. And she turned to Ji-won and asked if the human was prepared to proceed. Ji-won nodded and moved to the transport container, which sat on a table in the center of the demonstration area. And the container was a standard Earth pet carrier made of plastic and mesh, and she had decorated it with a small blanket inside that smelled like home, to help keep Commander Whiskers calm during his journey through space. And she explained to the watching crowd that she would now release the predator and asked everyone to remain calm and quiet as sudden noises might startle the animal. The silence that fell over the laboratory was profound and tense, and Hyun could see several aliens gripping their seats, or whatever their species used for seats, and Risa had all her recording devices focused on the carrier, and Professor Velnir's antennae were vibrating so fast they were nearly invisible. Ji-won opened the carrier door and stepped back, and for a long moment nothing happened, and then a small orange paw emerged, followed by a pink nose and whiskers, and Commander Whiskers stepped out onto the table and immediately sat down to begin washing his face with one paw, and the mundane nature of this action seemed to confuse the observers who had perhaps expected something more dramatic. The cat finished his grooming and looked around the laboratory with typical feline disdain for his surroundings, and his green eyes swept across the barriers and the crowd of aliens beyond, and he yawned, showing all his teeth, including the prominent canines that made several observers flinch. And then he spotted Hyun and made a small questioning sound that the translator tried and failed to render in any meaningful way. "That is the apex predator?" Someone in the crowd whispered loudly, and Hyun could hear the confusion in the question, because Commander Whiskers looked more annoyed than dangerous at the moment. And Ji-won explained that yes, this was a standard domestic cat of Earth, and while he might look small, he possessed all the hunting adaptations of his larger wild cousins. To demonstrate, Ji-won pulled out a toy from her bag, a simple feather on a string, and she dangled it in front of Commander Whiskers, and the cat's entire demeanor changed in an instant, and his pupils dilated to full black, and his body went low and tense, and his hindquarters began wiggling as he prepared to pounce, and the transformation from lazy pet to focused hunter was so complete that multiple alarms went off as the biological monitoring systems detected the predatory behavior. Commander Whiskers launched himself at the toy with impressive speed and caught it in his claws, and he proceeded to kick at it with his back feet while biting the feather, and Ji-won explained that this was called bunny kicking, and was how cats disemboweled prey in the wild, and several aliens made distressed noises while Boren leaned forward with intense scientific interest, despite his scales displaying alarm patterns. "And you allow this creature near your offspring?" Professor Velnir's voice came over the intercom system, and Ji-won nodded while showing a video on her tablet of Commander Whiskers sleeping, curled up with Hyun's niece, who was 3 years old. and the child had her arms wrapped around the cat who was purring contentedly, and the contrast between the hunting behavior they had just witnessed and the gentle companion in the video seemed to break something. In the alien's understanding, Hyun walked forward, slowly, and called Commander Whisker's name, and the cat immediately abandoned the toy and trotted over to rub against Hyun's legs, and the purring sound filled the laboratory amplified by the sensitive recording equipment, and Hyun bent down to pick up the cat who allowed himself to be lifted and settled into Hyun's arms like he belonged there. "This is trust," Hyun said, turning so the observers could see clearly. And Commander Whiskers looked completely relaxed with his eyes half closed in contentment, and Hyun explained that cats were obligate carnivores who needed to hunt to survive, but they had chosen to live with humans for thousands of years, and in exchange for food and shelter and affection, they provided companionship and pest control and emotional support. Ji-won took over the explanation and described cat behavior in technical terms, and she pointed out the slow blink that Commander Whiskers gave to Hyun, which was a sign of trust and affection in cat communication, and she explained how cats showed their bellies only to those they trusted completely, because it was their most vulnerable position, and Commander Whiskers demonstrated by rolling over in Hyun's arms and exposing his fuzzy stomach. Day stepped forward and held out his hand, and Commander Whiskers sniffed it carefully before allowing Day to pet him, and the cat's purring grew louder, and Day explained that this was how humans introduced themselves to cats. And you always let the cat smell you first and make the choice to accept contact, and the idea that the predator got to choose whether to accept the human seemed to alarm the observers even more. Taemin mentioned that cats were actually relatively independent compared to dogs, and he pulled up videos of dog behavior, showing the enthusiastic greetings and constant attention-seeking that characterized canine companions. And he warned everyone that when Mirai arrived with her husky next month, they should prepare for an even more energetic demonstration, and Professor Velnir made a sound that suggested she was already dreading that day. The demonstration continued for another hour, and Ji-won showed how to play with cats safely, how to read their body language, how to understand when they wanted attention and when they wanted space, and Commander Whiskers performed his role perfectly by being alternatively playful and affectionate, and occasionally aloof. And at one point he decided to take a nap right there in the middle of the laboratory floor, completely unconcerned by the audience of aliens. Young-ho, the security officer, finally spoke up and pointed out that in all his years of training, he had never once been called to respond to a cat-related security incident, and the biggest danger cats posed was knocking things off tables and occasionally scratching furniture. And he showed pictures of his own 3 cats at home who ruled his household with fluffy iron paws. 6 weeks had passed since the demonstration, and the Academy's newest research division occupied an entire wing of the station, and the Human Predator Paradox Project had attracted scientists from 15 different worlds, all trying to understand how one species could do what every other species considered impossible. And Soyeon had arrived from Earth as a consultant anthropologist, bringing with her centuries of human cultural data, and she now stood at the front of the packed symposium hall preparing to present findings that would challenge galactic understanding even further. Professor Kelvik from the Taraxian Institute of Psychology sat in the front row with his massive form hunched over a data tablet, and his species' predatory ancestry made him uniquely interested in the research, though even he found human behavior baffling. And next to him sat Hana, who specialized in animal behavior, and had spent the past month analyzing videos of human-animal interactions from across Earth's history. And Risa was there too, coordinating the vast amount of incoming data from dozens of research teams, and the room buzzed with anticipation for what everyone suspected would be groundbreaking revelations. Soyeon began by projecting a timeline that stretched back 50,000 years, and she explained that humans had not started befriending predators recently, but had been doing it since before recorded history. And archaeological evidence showed that humans and wolves had begun their partnership when humans were still living in caves and hunting with stone tools, and the timeline showed cave paintings of humans and canines hunting together, and burial sites where humans and dogs were interred side by side, suggesting deep emotional bonds even in ancient times. But here is what makes this truly remarkable, Soyeon said as she highlighted a specific period on the timeline. Humans were doing this while simultaneously being hunted by other predators, and we have evidence of saber-toothed cats, cave bears, and dire wolves all posing active threats to human survival. Yet humans chose to bring wolves into their camps and form partnerships with them. Hannah took over the presentation and displayed brain scans showing human neural activity during interactions with pets. And the scans revealed that humans released oxytocin when petting or playing with predatory animals. And oxytocin was the same hormone involved in parent-child bonding and romantic relationships. And the implication was clear that humans had somehow repurposed their familial bonding mechanisms to include other species entirely. Professor Kelvik raised one massive clawed hand and asked the question that had been bothering him since the research began. And he wanted to know if humans were somehow unaware of the danger these animals posed, perhaps lacking the proper threat assessment capabilities. And Soyeon shook her head and pulled up data, showing that humans were perfectly capable of recognizing danger. And in fact, human threat response systems were quite sophisticated, but humans had developed the ability to override these responses through conscious choice and cultural conditioning. The presentation moved to modern examples, and Hannah showed statistics that were almost unbelievable to the alien researchers. And she revealed that approximately 67% of human households contained at least one pet. And of those pets, the vast majority were predators like cats and dogs. And this meant that billions of humans were currently living with creatures that possessed the biological capability to harm them. And the number of incidents where these animals actually caused serious harm was so statistically insignificant that it barely registered. Boren, who had been attending every research session since the original demonstration, stood up to present his own findings. And he had been investigating the historical attempts by other species to befriend predators, and he had found exactly 17 documented cases across galactic history, and all 17 had ended badly. And in most cases, the individuals who attempted such bonding were suffering from neurological conditions that impaired their threat assessment. And the contrast with humanity, where predator befriending was not only normal but encouraged, made the pattern even more striking. Risa displayed comparative data showing brain chemistry across species, and she had worked with medical researchers to scan volunteers from multiple worlds, and the results showed that when prey species encountered predatory features like fangs or claws, their brains flooded with stress hormones and activated flight responses. And this happened even with images or videos, not just real predators. And the response was involuntary and overwhelming. But when humans encountered the same stimuli, their brains showed completely different patterns. And yes, there was an initial startle response, but it was quickly overridden by other systems. And if the predator was familiar like a pet, the human brain actually released reward chemicals and activated the same regions associated with seeing loved ones. And Kelvik stated flatly that this should not be possible according to everything known about evolutionary psychology. Soyeon pulled up historical and anthropological evidence showing that human predator befriending was not limited to cats and dogs, and she showed examples from cultures around the world of humans attempting to bond with bears, with big cats, with wolves, with crocodiles, with birds of prey, with literally any predator they encountered, and the success rate varied wildly. But the attempt itself was universal across human cultures regardless of geographic location or technological development. We even befriend predators that are not real, Soyeon said, and displayed images of stuffed toys shaped like bears and wolves and sharks. And she explained that human children were given these representations of predators as comfort objects, and they hugged them while sleeping. And this would be like a Quillarian child cuddling a plush version of the pack hunters that nearly drove their species extinct. And several aliens in the audience made sounds of distress at the imagery. Taemin had joined the research team as a student assistant, and he presented data on multi-species households, showing that humans regularly kept multiple predator species together. And he showed videos of cats and dogs living in harmony, of ferrets playing with cats, of households with sometimes 4 or 5 different predator species all coexisting peacefully, and he pointed out that these animals did not naturally get along in the wild, but under human care. They formed their own social structures. Hannah introduced a theory that she and Soyeon had developed together, and she suggested that humans were persistence predators who hunted by tracking prey over long distances until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. And this required incredible endurance but also required understanding the prey's mind. And humans had developed advanced empathy and theory of mind to predict animal behavior. And perhaps this same capability allowed humans to empathize with predators in ways that prey species simply could not. Professor Kelvik was nodding slowly, and he added his own perspective as a member of a species descended from ambush predators. And he said that even his people who understood hunting instincts on a biological level did not keep predators as companions, and the Taraxians had become strictly vegetarian, specifically to distance themselves from their predatory past. And the idea of embracing that heritage rather than rejecting it was fundamentally alien to their psychology. The discussion turned to the question of why humans did this, and Soyan presented evidence that the practice provided significant survival advantages, and dogs helped with hunting and guarding. Cats controlled vermin that threatened food stores, and the partnerships were mutually beneficial. But she pointed out that humans continued keeping these animals long after the practical benefits became unnecessary, and modern humans in cities with no need for hunting dogs or ratting cats still kept them purely for emotional satisfaction. Day had been working with the psychology division, and he presented interviews with human pet owners from across Earth, and the responses showed consistent themes of love and family and emotional support. And people described their pets as members of their family, as sources of comfort during difficult times, as beings that provided unconditional acceptance. And the emotional language used was identical to how humans described their relationships with other humans. One particularly striking example showed an elderly human woman who lived alone except for her 3 cats, and she stated that the cats were her family and she could not imagine life without them. And when asked if she was afraid of the cats despite their predatory nature, she had laughed and said she was more afraid of being alone than of any animal. And this sentiment appeared repeatedly across the interviews, suggesting that for humans, the emotional benefits of companionship outweighed any perceived danger. Risa had been investigating the physical health benefits, and she presented medical data showing that humans who kept pets had lower stress levels, better cardiovascular health, and longer lifespans on average, and the mechanism seemed to be related to the oxytocin release and the emotional support the animals provided, and interacting with these predators was literally making humans healthier. Professor Velnir, who had been relatively quiet during most of the symposium, finally spoke up, and she admitted that her original lecture had been based on what she considered universal constants, and she had never imagined that a species could violate those constants so thoroughly. 3 months had passed since Professor Velnir's original lecture, and the same lecture hall was now packed beyond capacity, with students sitting in aisles and standing against walls, and galactic media drones hovered near the ceiling recording everything, and representatives from a dozen different worlds had arrived specifically for this presentation. And Professor Velnir stood at the podium with all 4 arms arranged in a gesture of humility that her species reserved for significant admissions of error, and the room fell silent as she prepared to speak. "I was wrong," Velnir began without preamble or justification, and those 3 words carried across the hall with the weight of academic integrity confronting contradictory evidence, and she displayed the original slide from her lecture 3 months ago with its bold declaration that no species befriended apex predators, and she let it hang there for a moment before adding a new line that read, "except humans," in letters that seemed almost defiant in their simplicity. The revised presentation began with a comprehensive overview of the research that had consumed the Academy for the past months, and Velnir walked through the evidence systematically showing how humans had not merely befriended a few predators, but had made it a fundamental part of their civilization. And she showed the statistics again about pet ownership, about the billions of predators living in human homes, about the remarkably low incident rates, and she presented it all without editorial comment, letting the data speak for itself. Subin, who was a xenosociologist specializing in comparative cultural development, took over the next section, and she had compiled data that went far beyond just predator befriending, and she showed patterns of human behavior that revealed something even more profound about their species. And humans did not just befriend predators, but also befriended toxic plants, keeping them as decorations despite the danger. And they befriended insects like bees that could sting them repeatedly. And they lived in environments that should have been uninhabitable, from frozen tundras to scorching deserts to humid jungles. Humans do not avoid danger, Subin explained with academic precision. They approach it with curiosity and hope, and their first instinct when encountering something potentially harmful is not to flee or fight, but to ask if they can make it into a friend or a tool or a home. And this pattern repeats across every aspect of their civilization. Ambassador Junho from Earth's diplomatic corps had been invited to provide perspective, and he stood at the podium with the easy confidence of someone who had spent months fielding questions about his species' peculiarities. And he smiled at the assembled crowd and said that from humanity's perspective, none of this seemed strange. And he explained that humans were naturally social creatures who formed bonds easily, and they extended those bonds to animals because animals provided companionship and purpose and joy. "We are not fearless," Junho clarified as images of human-animal bonds played behind him. "We understand danger perfectly well, but we believe that most things are not inherently dangerous if approached correctly, and we see a predator not as something that wants to kill us, but as something that might choose not to if given reason, and usually, that reason is companionship and regular meals." The presentation shifted to video footage that had been specially prepared, and Mirai appeared on screen with her Siberian husky named Cloud, who had finally cleared quarantine the previous week. And the dog was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure with ice blue eyes and a thick coat and prominent teeth. And Mirai introduced Cloud to the camera, while the dog sat obediently beside her, radiating barely contained energy. The live demonstration began and Mirai entered the laboratory with Cloud on a leash, and the audience's reaction was immediate and visceral, with several aliens standing up as if preparing to flee. And Cloud was significantly larger than Commander Whiskers, and looked far more wolf-like with his pointed ears and long snout. And when he opened his mouth to pant, his teeth seemed designed for exactly what they were, which was tearing meat. But then Mirai gave a hand signal, and Cloud performed a series of tricks, including sitting and lying down and rolling over, and the dog's tail wagged constantly, creating a rhythmic thumping sound. And when Mirai called her children via video screen, Cloud's entire demeanor shifted to gentle excitement, and the two small children on the screen called to Cloud, who responded with soft whining sounds. And Mirai explained that Cloud was particularly gentle with children, understanding instinctively to modify his strength around small humans. Young-ho, the security officer, had brought his own contribution to the presentation, and he appeared with 3 cats and carriers. And he released them one by one, explaining that these were his personal pets from Earth. And the cats immediately began exploring the laboratory with typical feline independence. And one climbed onto Young-ho's shoulder and sat there like a furry scarf. And another decided that Dean Qualris's lap looked comfortable and attempted to jump up before Young-ho intervened apologetically. The contrast between the different animals was instructive, and Velnir pointed out that cats were solitary hunters while dogs were pack hunters, and they had completely different evolutionary histories and behavioral patterns. Yet humans had befriended both, and humans had adapted their care and interaction styles to suit each species' needs, and this suggested a remarkable flexibility. In human social behavior, Day stood up in the audience and asked if he could share something, and Velnir nodded permission, and Day pulled up images on his tablet showing horses, and he explained that humans rode on top of these large prey animals that could easily kill a human with a kick, and they trusted these animals to carry them at high speeds, and they formed deep emotional bonds with horses just as they did with predators. And the point he was making was that humans did not discriminate between predator and prey when choosing companions. Taman added that humans also kept reptiles and birds and fish and even spiders as pets, and each required different care and provided different types of companionship. And the common thread was not the type of animal but the human desire to connect with other living things. And he showed pictures of his cousin's tarantula, which made several aliens recoil, and his sister's parrot, which could mimic human speech. Professor Kelvik, who had become deeply involved in the research, stood to present his conclusions, and his massive Taraxian frame seemed to fill the front of the lecture hall, and he explained that after months of study, he believed he understood the fundamental difference between humans and other species, and humans had evolved as social persistence predators who succeeded through cooperation and endurance, and this had given them several unique traits including advanced empathy, exceptional pattern recognition, and most importantly, an extraordinary capacity for pack bonding that transcended species boundaries. Humans do not see the world divided into categories of threat and non-threat, Kelvik rumbled. They see potential pack members everywhere, and once something or someone is accepted into the pack, whether human or animal or even object, it becomes family, and family is protected and loved regardless of danger or logic. Soyan presented the emotional core of the research, and she showed interviews with humans explaining why they kept pets, and the answers were remarkably consistent across cultures and age groups. And people said their pets made them happy, made them feel less alone, gave them purpose, taught them responsibility, provided unconditional love, and these emotional needs were so strong that humans were willing to accept the minimal risk that came with keeping predators. One interview showed a young man crying as he described how his dog had helped him through depression, and the man said that on his worst days when he did not want to get out of bed, knowing that his dog needed to be fed and walked gave him a reason to keep going, and the dog asked nothing of him except companionship and care, and in return, the dog provided loyalty and affection without judgment. Risa presented data showing that the pattern was spreading, and after witnessing the human demonstrations, several brave aliens had begun asking questions about potentially befriending animals from their own worlds, and while none had actually attempted it yet, the fact that they were considering it represented a fundamental shift in thinking, and Boren had even admitted that he was curious about what it would feel like to have a companion animal, though his instincts still screamed danger. The presentation moved toward its conclusion, and Velnir returned to the podium with a final set of slides, and she acknowledged that humanity's ability to befriend predators was not a quirk or an anomaly, but represented something fundamental about their nature. And they were apex cooperators, who had survived not by being the strongest or fastest or most dangerous, but by being the best at forming alliances and building communities. What humans bring to the galactic community, Velnir said carefully, choosing her words, is a perspective we desperately needed, and they look at impossible relationships and ask not why they cannot work, but how they might work, and they approach danger with hope rather than fear, and they extend trust even when it seems illogical, and perhaps this is what civilization has been missing. Ambassador Junho was given the final word, and he stood before the assembled aliens with Cloud sitting calmly,